You're going to leave if you don't get what you want. Is that correct?
Well, City Council faces a choice. Do they want to embrace a vision of the future that includes ride-sharing and includes innovation in transportation? And that, by the way, aligns with the recommendations of city staff. Or do they want to turn the clock back to a world where only taxis are on the street for on-demand transportation? So that's what's in front of City Council. We'll take our direction from them, but we're very hopeful that City Council sides not only with the majority of Torontonians who support ride-sharing, but also with city staff who have recommended going that route.
But let's be clear. You've made a threat, and people who use Uber got this email saying that if you don't get what you want, you're leaving town. So what will be acceptable to Uber?
Certainly, and I should be clear. It's not so much that we get that what we want. It's that rules are created around ride sharing.
Which is what you want.
Well, because if they aren't, then ride sharing would be explicitly not allowed in the city.
What would force you to delete the app from the users in the city and leave town?
There would be some things that could be dressed up as ride sharing regulations that add enormous costs or red tape to individual drivers.
Like specifically what?
Specifically very high fees on drivers. So we know that rideshare drivers typically drive ride-sharing for a few hours a week. They're doing it on a part-time basis. So hundreds or thousands of dollars of fees on those drivers becomes very cost prohibitive for them.
In terms of, leveling that playing field is the phrase that people keep using.
Right.
What specifically are you looking for?
The same rules for the same job. A person in a vehicle and thousands of full-time and part-time taxi drivers in our city own their vehicles. Call what they're doing ride sharing or call what Uber's doing taxi service. They're operating the same way. They're providing the same service. And the government's role, as far as regulation is concerned, is to apply rules fairly in the interest of public safety.
So it doesn't matter whether I'm driving cab for you or whether I'm picking somebody up in my own car. You want the exact same rules.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'd say, too, what the staff report established, and this was after City Council voted that Uber was a taxi service, and Uber drivers are taxi drivers. They were included into the existing taxi regulation. The motion that resulted in the report that we're talking about was meant to look at the regulation for everyone and how we could all work together as a taxi system. And we've seen now instead that there's a completely two-tiered system. And even to Ian's point about insurance, they're not asking Uber drivers for commercial insurance. They're asking them for $2 million liability, what you might have on your car.
City Council has traditionally had many vested interests on the issues of taxis, to be frank. There was a great article in the Globe yesterday that made the point the taxi issue corrupts City Hall in many ways.
This was in the 1950s, though.
You're
talking about the Peter Cheney piece. This was in the 1950s, it's now 2016.
I think the point that he made was the politics around the issue have changed since the 1950s. The corrupting influence of the traditional taxi industry remains at City Hall.
You're saying the politicians now are in the pocket of the taxi industry?
Certainly some are. We've seen...
It's quite an accusation to make.
Well, I think I'm not the first one to make it. You look at the result of licensing committee 2 weeks ago, and that was a group of individual councillors who are strongly pro-taxi, some of whom are on the record as taking donations from taxi.
So which councillor do you think is in being corrupted by the taxi industry? If you're going to make a broad allegation, zoom in a little bit. Which councillor is in that pocket?
I don't think I'm going to make an allegation that anyone is individually corrupted. I think the point I'm making is broadly the industry corrupts decision-making in the sense that does it align the incentives of councillors with the incentives of the public? Because if you look at the will of the public on this, not only does polling show that over 70% of Torontonians support ride-sharing, not only has the mass outreach to councillors supported that fact, so you see the will of popular opinion and public opinion asking councillors to make a decision, yet many councillors are resisting that because of long-standing relationships or allegiances to vested interests.
Do you think your industry is corrupting City Council?
I absolutely, completely disagree with that, and I must say I'm a little bit stunned to hear it.
Are taxi companies, plate owners lining the pockets of councillors to get votes? I mean, he's not making specific allegations, but saying that this is what's happening.
I'd say absolutely not. I mean, I have no idea. People develop relationships in a regulated industry with the people who are creating those regulations and potentially enforcing them just based on years of being in the same city hall together. To suggest that it's anything more than making sure everyone is staying informed, making sure that the industry is communicating with the people who are making rules, anything more than that is just absurd.
What's one thing that you would say to him about this fight that you're in right now?
I think I'd say probably just the redefining of words has been tough. Words like ride sharing, for example. These are vehicles for hire. They are paying passengers. These people are making money. And I think the other side of it, too, is, based on the day. One day it's, we'll lose 15,000 jobs in Toronto. Then the next day, depending on the discussion, it's, they only work a few hours a week. So I guess it's exhausting, the confusion that's being created.
Ian?
Christine makes a good point. I mean, times are changing, and with that, vocabulary changes and industries change. And that's just a reality of our world. I think one thing I would say to Christine is it's a very good point that safety standards and equality of safety should be the same across all platforms. But there's a very good distinction, which is the taxi rules today have a firm limit on the number of vehicles that can exist. And that limit has placed very high cost, very low reliability, and has limited transportation to thousands of Torontonians. So it's fair to say that there should be equality across safety rules, but just applying old taxi rules to a new model doesn't make sense because it holds back the evolution of transportation in the city.
I think I'd say when it comes to the limit on the number of vehicles, that's something that's always been in place to protect the income of these drivers. I think the more vehicles we invite on the road, absolutely, the less money each person can make.
And so, Ian, to that point, and what you just said, what about the people who decided they're going to play by the rules? The people who invested in the plates that cost $300,000 and now see their income being hollowed out?
And it's the right question to be asking because we need to worry about these things. The experience of other cities, though, is comforting. You look at all those cities I listed earlier that have ride-sharing and taxi. Taxi continues to be a big and healthy part of the transportation mix. You go to New York, you certainly see taxis everywhere on the street still. Same with Chicago or San Francisco. So as more people take on-demand transportation, there's room for taxi just as there's room for ride-sharing and car-sharing.